Hello, welcome to Digital Thangka Workshop. My name is Ben Christian. In Tibetan, my name is Jampe Dorje, and this is going to be a short tutorial on how to use a photograph and to manipulate it so that it looks like a painted element of your finished thangka. So often we're required to do a landscape, and often that landscape needs to be complex and detailed. But very often it can also just be a very simple landscape, and that's what I'm hoping to achieve today. The very simple landscapes are very evocative from a meditative sense, and when things are bare and there's a lot of space element and there's a very simple gradient, that absence of elaboration is a very profound metaphor for the experiences of the meditator. And so if we can bring that to our painting, then hopefully it can add another element. Okay, so what I'm hoping to achieve today is something similar to this image that was created by Robert Beer. Now, Robert Beer is one of my favourite artists, in fact, probably my favourite artist. And he in his work, he really got a real sense of open space. And a lot of metaphor for meditative experiences in the way that he painted. So I try to emulate that as much as I can. And also, as I've said before, I try and emulate the work of the older Chinese-based Thangkas in their treatment of landscape and colour. Those artists that were primarily in the Situ Panchen school really had took the best of Chinese landscape painting and brought it into their beautiful Tibetan thangkas. So that's what I try to copy if I can. So if we just zoom in here, we can see, take a look at what Robert Beer's created here. So here's a complete absence of any landscape element, other than perhaps you could say the Vajra rock formation, simple floral offering at the bottom. We've got the main figure of the meditator, but here this is what I want to try and work with in this this tutorial. This element of space that's created by this very misty, mysterious mountain range. What's being dealt with here is a thing called atmospheric perspective, and as I said, that's a very, very potent metaphor for the mind of the meditator. That open, clear, very clear, space-like awareness with a complete absence of elaboration. So to do that, we can paint. So here we can see Robert Beer has, this is done with a airbrush, I think, I'm pretty sure. And it's just very simple. It looks like he's created a mask here of some sort, a number of different masks, and just used that to spray on with, basically 2 or 3 colours here. He's got, a warm colour here, and then going to some cooler colours, also some cooler colours in the foreground, and then this very warm sand-like colour that predominates the space. So going from a warm beige gradient up to a beautiful blue gradient, just like the sky. So how can we create that in our thangka without having to use airbrush and without having to do a lot of work? One of the methods that I use is to use a photograph. So just as a word of warning, this can be a complete disaster if you get it wrong. It has to fit the thangka, and it has to fit the style, and it has to be has to be a subtle element. It's very hard to get this right. And probably the main element to getting this right is starting with the right photograph. So here I'm on holidays at the moment, and I drove up to my holiday apartment, which is at Mount Hotham, which is in the Australian Alps. And you come out of the sort of the low, hot country of sort of northern Victoria, and you start travelling through the Alps. And as you come up in altitude, you get this this great sense of expanse. And the feeling of that expanse is accentuated by this thing called atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective is one of the ways we can use to make things look as though they're either in the foreground, the midground, or the background. And it's something that we take for granted because we see it every day, but the effect on the eye is like this. It's two main effects. One is that contrast becomes less. So here you can see in what's the foreground, this little ridge here. There's a great deal of contrast. There's also a lot of saturation, and the colours are reasonably accurate. As we get deeper, this next ridge here decreases in contrast, the colours become less accurate, and they become cooler. And then to this next range, which is the next one, then we've lost almost all contrast. And the colour is completely inaccurate. It's now blue, or a kind of purple maybe. And then as we go back, we see less and less contrast and more corruption of the colour, moving towards cooler colours. So here we started warm and we gradually go cool. So that's the first secret to creating atmospheric perspective in our Thangka, is to follow that rule. You can also see that there's the great thing about Robert Beer's work with the airbrush is that you're just defining the ridge. This should never, to my mind, rely on any form of outline. It's just a gradient dropping away. And the beauty of that, the subtlety of that, is what we want to try and bring to our Thangka. Okay, so I'm driving up and I knew I wanted to paint this image. I knew what I wanted, so all I wanted was a basic photograph. This is no way is a good photograph. All I wanted to capture is some mountain range dropping away. What I wanted to find at minimum is just some interesting shapes. What I also know is that in Photoshop I can change these shapes. I can distort all of this to make it look very mountainous. I can make one side look higher and one side look lower. So I'm not particularly fussed to find the perfect image as it will appear in the Thangka. I'm just looking for something that's going to be manipulatable or able to be manipulated in the best way. Now, it doesn't matter if you snap this on your phone, it doesn't matter what it is, or even if it's just a very small part of a very large image, like a little area in the background here. When you distort this, any detail that you have will be lost, and that's actually what you want. The thing that will make this stand out as though it is a photograph is if you see trees and bits of grass and things like that. So you shouldn't worry about maybe you just captured a beautiful little section here that you want to use. When you bring that into your Thangka and you apply the right filters, then that will be fine. Any corruption that comes from pixelation or anything like that will be lost. So you shouldn't worry about that. Even if it's just a small section that's very, very poetic, you can always use that. Okay, so what do? Let's take a look at our image. Here's our blank canvas. So the first thing I have is, in the same way that we spoke about with Robert Beer's image, is just a simple gradient. So this is the gradient I've chosen for this image. It's just very, very basic, warm colour going to a cool colour, and fairly light. Now onto that canvas I'm going to place the figure of the central deity, which will be in the middle. There'll be a smaller figure at the top, sun and moon. There'll be a great deal of, in this particular Thangka, there'll be a lot of rainbow effect in the sky, probably no cloud. And then I just want a very simple landscape down the bottom. So to give you a bit of a sneak peek of what we're going to create, I'll just turn that landscape on for you. So there's our landscape. In this case, I wanted to be very misty with clouds cascading over. So onto that landscape, I'll just place some basic elements. So there's my sun and moon. And then just to help things along, I generally always add the texture right from the beginning. So I've got my usual 2 texture layers, which I've always spoken about in the past. One just breaks up the digital colour, so it looks like it's been done by a human hand. And the second adds a canvas texture. So there you can see the canvas texture, hopefully. Just turn that on and off. It's just a subtle thing. I find that if I have the textures from the beginning, it can help you make more informed decisions about what's going to work and what's not going to work, because the texture can do wonders for areas that look flat. Okay, so down the bottom of the Thangka, this is where we're going to add our landscape element. Here's our landscape element. The only part I want, I mean, as I said, I could pick anything, but I think for this tutorial, I'll pick this band that runs across here. So I'll just grab the lasso tool. You could easily use the marquee tool. And I'll just come across, select that. Not worried about being accurate or anything, because this is going to receive a lot of distortion in the finished Thangka. We just try to sample something, really. So there's my selection. I'll press Command C to copy that. Go back to our image, and then Command V, paste. Okay. So let's talk about a few steps to get this to blend into our image before we start distorting it. The first thing to say is, here I've chosen a colour image. It could equally be a black and white image, because what we're going to do is we're going to move this to soft light blend mode, which is our old favourite. And then if I go to soft light blend mode, then the colour information of the picture becomes less important, and what becomes important is the brightness or the contrast. So with soft light blend mode, all the blend modes, if you didn't know, that are bound in this little section here, they're actually logically organised, even though we tend to just pick one that looks good in practice. Overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light and hard mix all lighten and darken the image. That's their common theme, and the way they do it is different, and the way they affect saturation is different. Soft light is the most subtle of all of these. Some, as in the next group up, only lighten the image, and the next group up only darken, multiply, colour burn, linear burn. Here we want to lighten and darken the image according to our photograph. Okay, so if I move this down, you'll notice that it changes. So it's the way that the soft light blend mode works depends on what's below the image. So if you'll see as I move it down, as it gets to a darker colour below it, you'll notice that the picture darkens as well. And there we are all the way down the bottom. So a couple of things we want to deal with here first up. Just looking at this straight away, the colour is all wrong. The background is nowhere near as saturated as this image. So what we need to do is we need to manage the colour information that's in our photograph. If it was a black and white image, we wouldn't have to go through this step, because it would simply be working with the colour that's below it. But here it's also superimposing some colour information. So I would recommend using colour rather than black and white. It's going to depend on your image, but the reason I say that is because you don't want to just have light and dark versions of this colour that's below it. You actually want some subtlety in the colour variance in this bottom section. So I'll show you what I mean. If I just go Command U, which brings up the hue and saturation dialog box, and I remove all saturation from that image, then you can see what I mean. Now it's talking the same color language as the background, but it's become very monochromatic, and there's not a lot of color value there. So what I would do is do that, reduce the saturation completely, or just leave a little bit in there, just to get some colour variation in that bottom part of the picture. So for me, I'm looking here, I'm looking at about, I reckon about 70%. Could even go up to maybe, let's say 50-60%. So that's leaving some colour information in there. The other thing you can do, just before I accept that, is you can use the colorize function. And what that will do is it'll enable you to change the overall effect according to the colour that you choose. So what colorize does is it takes out all the colour information, but instead of making it black and white, it makes it blue and white, or red and white, or green and white, if that makes sense. And so that colour information will filter through. So you can experiment with that as well. Again, you're going to want to knock down the saturation. But if you want your mountains to have a greenish hue, you can do that. If you want them to be warm, which is probably the most likely option that you'd choose, maybe, you can do something like that. But for us, we're not going to do that. We're just going to desaturate by that 50 or so percent that we spoke about. Okay. So there we are. So straight up, we're now starting to talk the same colour language as our background, and the image is starting to fit in. The next thing we want to do is get it to blend in even more. And the way we'll do that is we'll go to the advanced blending dialog box, and the main thing I want to do here is knock out this white sky and just leave this mountain range. So you could run along here with the eraser, for example, and erase that completely. But in this kind of what's known as compositing, it's much better if you learn to use this dialog box, because it enables you to do some pretty cool effects once you have multiple layers stacking up. So the way to do that is you double click on your layer, not on the name and not on the icon, but in this large empty section here, and that brings up, it's called layer style. And these sliders down here, I won't give you a complete explanation on this. There'll be something on YouTube you can look up. But what this is saying is I'm going to make this photograph transparent depending on how light or dark the pixels are. So if I want the dark pixels to be transparent, then I slide this that way. And what this is saying is all the pixels on the left-hand side of these little arrows will become transparent. So if you watch the mountain range down the bottom, down here, that will begin to become transparent once I reach the the tonal value that mountain range represents. So you can see disappearing, and now it's gone. So that's pretty cool. So if you didn't want that mountain so dark, you can remove it in a very skillful way, and it remains completely editable. Now if we zoom in on what I've done there, you can see it's created a little bit of a hard line there. If you hold down the Alt key and click on those two arrows, then they split apart. Lots of people don't know, this is kind of a bit of a hidden secret. It should be a bit more obvious, I think. And what that does is in that area that's between those two arrows, it creates a feathered selection. So now I can say I want everything between this arrow and that arrow to gradually transition into transparent, and you can get a lot more subtlety that way. So that's pretty cool. We're not looking to remove the dark part of this image. What we're wanting to do is remove the light part. So we come across to the light side. Move to the light, he said. Click Alt, which splits them, creates a feathered transition. And you just start moving them until it disappears. Okay, so I've gone too far there. There it goes. Okay, now that's an abrupt transition. I want a smoother transition, so I'll now move the other slider across. And there we have our mountain range. Disappearing. Now you just play with those until you get the effect you want. That's the effect I want. You can see here I've still got some line there. So what I'm going to do is I'll just select a big fat soft eraser, and I'll just feather that edge by hand. Okay, there we are. So this Thangka has kind of a wrathful feel to it. So a flat landscape doesn't lend itself to a wrathful or a powerful mode. So I'm going to turn up the amplitude or the volume, and we'll see what we can create. So Command T. So the first thing to do is to get these mountains looking not like an Australian mountain. In Australia, the highest mountain we have is like 2,000 metres, which in most countries, wouldn't even qualify as a mountain. So in Australia, we have to turn the volume up a bit to get things to look a little bit more jagged and more dramatic. So by transforming like this, we can get things. Now, in most Thangkas, what you're going to want is, depending on your composition, but generally you'd be wanting to have a V-shaped composition here in the bottom. Central figure would be here, and you'd be wanting these mountain ranges to converge into a valley. So I'll just accept that, and let's do some finessing of that range. So I'll press Command T again, and what I'll go up to now is this this dialog box here, which is, I think it's called the Warp dialog box, and that will enable me to create some bit more drama. Okay, starting to look a bit better. We've got a big blank spot down here, so what I'm going to do is I'll grab the smudge tool, and you could paint this, but I'm just going to smudge it down. And again, I'm not worried about destroying any pixel information here, because later on we're going to apply some filters. Okay, so I'll show you the central theme here is to have this what's called a wrathful offering to this six senses, and that has that triangular composition. So what I need is another dark element that's triangular over here. So what I'll do is I'll take the lasso tool and I'll copy that. It's going to want to go to soft light blend mode again. And I'm just going to move that over this side. of the image. And as I'm transforming it, I'm just going to, just so it doesn't look like I've copied it to the other side, you just need to create a little bit of distortion there so that it has an element of symmetry, but it's not completely symmetrical. This is a very, very powerful tool in your Thangka painting, is to create design through repetition. It's a very, very common theme, if not the predominant theme in Thangka painting. All clouds, for example, flames, are all designed through repetition. We'll do the same thing here. That white line at the top we don't want, so we'll just remove that. I'll just play around with the feather on this top edge. I'm not liking that at the moment, so we'll come down a little bit. Okay, it's starting to look good. So now we've got this kind of Mordor-like look to it, which, as I said, is kind of what I was wanting. I'm just doing a bit of smudging here. And it's starting to look more like something that's been painted by hand. I think I'll merge those two layers. I'll see what happens when I merge them. Sometimes unexpected results can happen. Okay, it's not what I wanted. So, okay, maybe I won't. The mountain range I'm wanting needs to be higher than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another range behind it, and I could sample another photograph. I could sample within this if I wanted. You could easily. I mean, we could just experiment now. Maybe if I clone this little peak here. See what happens. You've got to select the right layer for that to work. Yeah, so I'm not going to do, but you can certainly experiment with that. If you took some care to do that, I think that could easily work. Within the clone stamp dialog box, there's options to rotate and to distort each time you do it, so it doesn't look like you've just stamped something on. Create some variance, or you could simply the other option you could do would be to get your lasso tool, create a feathered selection of, let's say, 50 pixels, and start picking the places you want. Command C, Command V. Remember that when you do that, it's going to be it's going to come back as a normal layer, so you need to go back to soft light, and then you can just and your blending options will disappear as well. Here we don't want any of the lightning to happen, we just want a dark section. So let's say we'll take it out of soft light and we'll go to multiply, which only darkens. So what I'm doing here is I just need to get that sky so that it's white. Okay, so that's it. I want to not take all of the saturation out of that. Not quite all of it. Adjust the opacity of it. And then you've got a little peak you can position as you like, just to fine-tune your composition. Okay, so that's another option for you. And of course, if you feel like that's looking too much like that, then it's just Command T for transform. And you've got another little landscape element in the background. And there you go. Okay, so that's not what we're going to do here. I'm going to copy the whole layer, which is our main layer here. This one. Let's see what happens when we do that. So to do that, I just drag that down into the to the new layer icon, and that effectively duplicates the layer. Now let's transform that. So the first thing I'm going to do is flip the layer, because I don't want that mountain peak, which is a very predominant feature, sticking up above that. I don't want it directly above it. That's going to look strange. Okay, so here we are up there. I'm going to feather the bottom of that with the eraser tool. I want to knock out this dark patch there. So we'll use our blending again. Alt to separate. And there you can see that mountain range just starting to disappear. You remember the atmospheric perspective effect we had is that things get lighter, less colour, and less contrast. So this is effectively removing the contrast, because I'm wanting these layers to appear, this mountain range, sorry, to appear further back than the original. I want to try and get that that fuzzy smog line out of it. Okay, so we'll do that. I'm going to remove the saturation of this layer completely, because I think it's the saturation is adding there. Okay, so not completely. Remember we said our other effect is that things get more blue or purple. So here we've got an opportunity to have our receding part of the mountain range change in colour as well. So let's make it a bit more purple. Just so there's some variation. It's still a bit loud. I'm going to transform that. Okay, that's better. So remember, we're wanting these converging leading lines here. So I'm just working to get that that mountain range leading down to our Rothwell offerings. So you can see there all those lines converge at a point of interest. I'm going to reduce the opacity of that background section because it's a little bit too loud. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I think that's starting to work. If this isn't, or it may be what I use in the finished image, but I'd be spending another couple of an hour or so refining this part of the image. But just for this tutorial, we'll say that that's good enough. And what we'll do is we'll look at the last step, which is to try and if you look closely, let's say here, you can see there's some pine trees or some gum trees rather here. You can see this ridge line. There's some trees here. You may or may not want that. It's up to you. But for me, I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'll choose one of my favourite filters for making a photograph look painted. There's a couple of... Photoshop has a couple of packaged filters. So if we go up here into filter and you go into, I think it must be artistic or something like that, there's a watercolor filter, for example. So you can muck around with those. Let's take a look, filter gallery. So artistic, there's a few things here that will try and do a computer attempt. At altering this photograph into something that looks photographed. So you can, that's called rough pastels, so which looks a little bit like dry brush shading. Sponge, you wouldn't want that. You know, these things all devalue the image into something that looks kind of painted. So that's cool, but it's not what I'm going to use. My preferred filter is just simply to go into the noise sub-box and then median. Median's a very handy filter. So you can see there, if I turn that on and off, so it'll remove all the trees, for example. So if I select a low radius, looks a little bit like a photograph. You can think of median as smoothing things out, and you just play with it until you get the effect you want. So now it's starting to look very what would you say, blobby or airbrushed. I mean, you can see it even takes out the ridge in that mountain range. And you're going to want to be zooming in and out to see what the effect is. Okay, so I think that's about right for me, 59 pixels. It's a fairly processor intensive filter, so it takes a little while to work. That's a bit too much. You can always, okay. There's always an option if something is too much, and you, instead of going back to the original filter, you can always choose this command fade, and that's available for everything. Even a single brush stroke or a single eraser mark you can fade. So if you do something and think, oh yeah, that's right, but it's just a little bit too heavy, then you can bring it back to 80%, 70%, 2% if you want, using the fade command. But the fade command is only available for one step. As soon as you do anything, it will disappear. So we'll go back. And let's halve that, see what it does. Yeah, okay, that's better. Unfortunately, I'm losing some detail here. So again, if I wasn't making a tutorial, I'd be doing maybe duplicating these layers and erasing the areas that I wanted to be more or less subtle. But for this tutorial, we'll just forge ahead. So now I'm just pressing the shortcut Command F, which applies the last used filter, and I'll just do that to all the layers that affect this background. Well, that's our little mountain that we had before. You can put him somewhere if you want. I'm just going to delete that because I don't want it. Here I'm not liking this that ridge, so I'll just actually use the eraser tool to feather that back a bit. Okay. Now let's see how we go with our composition. So there's our offerings. We're not looking too bad. In terms of our leading lines in our composition. If there was something that you wanted to change, this is the last thing I'll cover before we finish the tutorial. Let's say there's something you wanted to change. The most predominant feature we have is this little mountain peak, and you don't like the shape of that. You can paint in here if you want, but if you're more of a, an easier way sometimes is just to, rather than trying to create something new or change, is just to smudge something around. So you can use the smudge tool, which I wouldn't recommend. What I would do here is just make sure you've got the correct layer selected. Okay, layer 34 for me. Come up here to filter, and I don't use this a lot, but it's when you need it, it's invaluable, the liquefy filter. So here we are in liquefy, and let's make an adjustment to that mountain range. Okay, there's our mountain range. This is all fairly straightforward. There would be many tutorials on the web about how to use the liquefy dialog box. The only thing you've got to watch is this backdrop setting here. This can really confuse you if you have multiple layers. So here all we're looking to do is just to smudge it around a bit. So you can see there I can change the shape. And it's the same with any elements. So you can, once you've got your basic elements in place, then you can really do what you want. And because this is so, as I said, you've devalued the original image so much, you can really, if you do it at the right time, you can really do almost anything, transform it any way you want, smudge it however you want. And then when you go to apply the median filter, which is one of the last things you should do, which I haven't done here, we've already done it, but when you apply the median filter, all that corrupted pixel information will go away. And in fact, the median filter, that's exactly what it's for. It's for reducing very strong noise. But no one would really use it for that anymore. There's much more advanced ways of removing noise now, but Photoshop didn't have that option all that long ago. Okay, so there's our image. Command Z will toggle on and off our little bit of, so you can see there, we'll zoom out. So that's our liquefy, and you can see it hasn't degraded the image quality at all. And there it is. Now again, up to you, the strength of all of these effects can be changed with the opacity command. So I can go to very subtle if you want. So I'm feeling like that's a bit better for me. I'm feeling like these areas are too dark, so let's go back into our, that one I can change it just by reducing the opacity. Here, let's go back into our advanced blending options, and we just want to knock out a little bit more of that. Sorry, it's the wrong layer. We just want to knock out a little bit of that black. There it goes. Okay, so there we go. So you can see we've got a really nice, misty, smoky windless, fog-laden valley there, which is exactly the effect I wanted. For this Thangka, it needed to have this, like I said, a feeling of space with a lack of elaboration, meaning that the background should be very, unsharp or unmarked by edges or lines or anything like that, or trees or any kind of embellishment. And it should also have this very still quality, like a pranic aftermath, I guess you could say, because this Thangka that I'm working on at the moment is all about someone's direct perception of emptiness, or this is a Nyingma painting, so I guess Rigpa, and the way that primordial mind manifested as a divine interaction. So that's what this painting's about, and that's what I'm hoping this background is trying to be suggestive of. So I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. The next tutorial I'll do for this particular image is, being a Nyingma painting, there's a stack of rainbows need to occur. So I'm going to add some rainbow elements in the top part and some coming down here in the bottom as well. It's kind of a new thing for me. I haven't done a lot of rainbow light effects before. They'll be done traditionally, so they'll look traditional, I guess is what I'm saying. And unfortunately I can't show you the image. It's a secret practice and you need the empowerment to see it, but I'll try and get these tutorials so that you can at least get a feeling for what the Thangka is, and I may even just superimpose a main a central figure from another Thangka I've done that's not to do with secret practice. So yeah, again, I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you're learning something, and I look forward to making more tutorials.